This video is what I would consider to be the ultra basics of typography. So if this video sends you down into the typography rabbit hole, you're welcome. You can thank me later. But first of all, my name's Ty. I'm a graphic designer, and I've been working with typography for 6 years at this point. That's kind of crazy. Um, yeah, but we're recording this live. There's no editing here, so I hope you'll bear with me as I try to explain to you why typography is actually pretty awesome. Now, before we get into this discussion, and in order to kind of vindicate myself a little bit, let's talk about why typography even matters. Because if you're going to be sitting and watching this video, I think it's important to understand why this stuff even matters. And so there's two reasons why I think it matters. And the first one is because it puts a brand's voice in visual form. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by this in just a second. But the second reason why typography matters is that typography affects the reader's feeling towards an idea. So here's what I mean by both of these ideas. Let's say you find a note on your desk from some unknown stranger, and it only has 2 words on it, but it looks like this. Okay, you know, that probably puts a certain picture in your mind or a certain thought in your mind when you read that. But imagine the same message is on your desk from the same unknown mysterious person, except it looks like this. You know, there's a little bit of a different feeling there, isn't there? And so this is an example of voice and typography. So at least for me, when I look at this, there's a specific voice in my head, a specific way that I read it. I read it in a little bit more of a fancy way, and versus this guy here, I read it as more scary and more like a threat. Now the thing is, the typography here also affects the reader's feeling towards the idea. So for this one, when I see this one, I think, hey, I'm going on a date. Like, this is going to be romantic. Let's go. But the feeling I get for this one is like, I'm in danger. And so that's a visualization. That's an example of both of these explanations of typography in practice. So that's why typography matters. All right, now with that out of the way, let's talk about different types of fonts. Now there's 3 types that I'm going to be talking about in this video. There's definitely more styles out there, but to keep it simple, we're going to talk about these 3. So we have serif, sans serif, and display. All right, what is a serif? So a serif is this guy right here. So it's these little decorative flourishes on a character that, I don't know, they look nice. They're decorative. Well, sans serif, sans literally means without. So if we look on this A in the same spot, we can see that there's no serif. So there's quite literally, this is without serif. So that tracks. And then finally we have display fonts. Now this is kind of weird looking. It's very interesting. We'll come back to this in a little bit. But let's talk about where to use each of these types of fonts. So let's start with serifs first. So a serif font, you would want to use it when the idea you convey, you want the idea to appear traditional, or maybe you want it to appear timeless, or you want your idea to feel trustworthy. Serif fonts innately have this type of quality to them where they just appear trustworthy. And so because of that, banks use this all the time, law firms, university. Really, anyone who cares about heritage or legacy will want to put a serif font front and center. Now, some examples of serif fonts are Baskerville, Instrument Serif, and Gluck. This is a serif font, even though it's very different, and it has a lot more personality than the other ones. All right, let's move on to sans serif fonts. So these are good when you want to appear modern. Sans serif fonts also don't impose themselves very much, and so they also appear very neutral, and they have better readability to them as well. So that's why tech startups use sans serif fonts all the time, because they want to appear modern. The fashion industry also uses sans serif quite a lot, And really, any idea or any type of brand that would want to convey that they really care about simplicity or innovation would focus on sans serif fonts. All right, now some examples of sans serif fonts. We have Inter, Montserrat, and Roboto. Moving on to display. All right, so these ones are very different. Now, display fonts are great for use in logos. They can be used in headlines. Really anything that needs to grab attention, display fonts are pretty good at. Now, because of that, because display fonts are so different, they do need to be used more sparingly. But the good thing about them is that they show personality. So if there's a specific personality that you want your identity, your brand to convey, a display font is great to do that. And they're very unique. So they can set you apart like hardly anything else can. Now, display fonts do need to be used sparingly. If they're overused, it's just hard to read. And so I included these sub bullet points of the same information just in a sans serif font because display fonts can be kind of hard to read. So some examples of display fonts, we have Nabla. This utilizes newer technology to appear 3D and with built-in color. This font is called Oi, and that looks pretty interesting. And then another font we have here is Plaster. So pretty cool looking. Now, here's the thing. We do have these use cases for each of these fonts, but of course the use cases can overlap. So, for example, we have a fashion brand. Now, a fashion brand might use a serif font for their logo, but for the marketing material that they put out, well, they might use a sans serif font because they really want the message to come across easily. They want it to be readable. And so you can totally mix and combine these types of fonts. You don't have to strictly stick to one. You can combine them for maximum effect. All right, moving on. We're going to talk about how to measure type. Now, type is measured in points. Points is the vertical height of the character. So 1 point is 1/72 of an inch. I like to say 1/72. But anyway, a point is 0.014 inches or 0.35 millimeters tall. And then 72 points make up 1 inch. So over here on the left or on the right, I have a whole bunch of examples of point sizes. So we have 72 point right here. If we were to print this on a page, that would be 1 inch tall. Now, when you're designing or you're laying out your typography for print, for physical media, the sweet spot is around 8 to 14 points. And then if you're designing for digital, it's between 12 to 18 or 15 to 25 pixels, that range. Now, we have an example down here. This is a 10-point font. This is a 12-point. This is an 18-point. So when you're designing for digital, you do want the font to be a little bit bigger because screens have pixels, and just to make it simple, make your point size or your pixel size a little bit bigger than you would for print. Now, I have an example of why the point size really matters here. And that is because you can establish hierarchy in the way that, and the order rather, that the reader reads the text. So for example, I'm going to pop this up. And I gave you a second to look at it. But my best guess, is that you read this first. And then you dropped down to here. And then you came back up to here. That's my guess of what your eyes did. And I numbered it here. So we have 1, 2, 3. I bet you that's the order of the lines that you read this in. If I'm wrong, or if I nailed it, dude, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to know. But the point I'm making is that point size matters because it dictates what you read first more than the order of the lines. So point size creates a hierarchy. We read bigger text first. That's just kind of how it works. And so you can use that to your advantage to order or structure the things that you are typing. Now, I also bet with this page, the first thing you saw, because I was scrolling, was this. And then you immediately jumped down to this. And then when you saw this, you went back up to here, read all the way down here, and then you went up to here and went down like that. So your mind went all across this page. I bet you that's what happened. And if that is what happened, also let me know in the comments because I'm pretty curious. So that's how we measure type. We use points. Now we're going to break down the anatomy of a line. So we have a line of text here, and I'm gonna explain the anatomy of this line. So there's a lot more that goes into it than you might initially think, and it's pretty interesting actually. So there's an invisible line upon which all the text sits, and that's called the baseline. So there's an invisible line, all the text sits on top of this baseline. Now there's another invisible line, which is the height of all of these small letters. So all of these curves, everything comes up to about this height, and that actually has a name. It's called the X height. And if you draw an X, which we have here, you can see it fills up the entire height. So the lowercase letters fit within the X height. Now, if you look around, you can notice that we actually have little bits of letters going above and below the X height and the baseline, and there's a name for that. So for capital letters, we have the cap height, and that is the height of all the capital letters. None of the capital letters go bigger than the cap height. So that's called the cap height. And then as you can see with this F, it goes above the X height and it goes just a bit above the cap height. Now this part of a letter is called the ascender. So letters like D, F, T, L, those types of letters, they all have ascenders because they raise above the X height. But we have G here, well, that goes below the baseline, and there's a name for that too. So we have descenders as well. So that's letters like G, P, Q, Y, things like that. So that is the breakdown of the different lines that form a line. Now we also have invisible gaps or invisible shapes, you could say, that dictate the spacing of a line. So if we look at the total distance between all of the letters in a line, that is called tracking. So the unified distance between all the letters on this line, we bundle it up and call it tracking. Now if we look at the individual spacing between individual letters, that is called kerning. Oops, I clicked the wrong one. Okay, so the gap between individual letters is called kerning. Now, I spoiled it a little bit, but we also have a gap between two lines, and that is called leading. Now, leading is measured from baseline to baseline. So it's measured from here to here. And there's actually a formula that we can use to calculate optimal leading. I'll get into that in just a second. Don't worry, it's still super easy. But just to review everything, the space between all of the letters in a line is called tracking, and the space between individual letters is called kerning. Now, there are certain pairs of words that require extra attention when it comes to kerning, and I have the wrong font set up. Okay, let me get this ready here. So if we look at an A and a W, and we compare this to these letters here. So the distance between the A and the W requires specific kerning in order for it to not look awkward. If the kerning is too wide, it'll look weird. So sometimes we need to manually close the gap, close the distance between two individual letters to make it look, just to make it look right. Now, a lot of fonts will do this automatically, but specifically in things like logo design or in word marks, you need to customize the kerning so that there's not awkward spaces in them. And so that's what kerning is, the distance between two individual letters, and that's important to keep track of. Now, I do have an example that shows why tracking and leading is so important, especially for readability. And that's right here. So we have a block of text, and if you stopped for a moment and you tried to read this, you could probably get through it, but it's just not very legible. It's kind of hard to get through. There's colliding parts of letters with the line above, and overall it's just not great. Well, that's because we don't have very good tracking or leading. The distance between the letters is too big, and the distance between the lines is too small. Now we can calculate an optimal amount of tracking with this formula. So an optimal amount of tracking is about 124 to 130% of its point size. So this is 24-point font, which means if we multiply it by 1.24, we get 29.8, and that should be our tracking in order to get, or not our tracking, our leading for optimal readability. And when we do that, it looks like this. This is so much easier to read. This is so much better. So that's because we have a leading of 29.8. And in Affinity, leading is right here, and I can change this and customize it. So if I wanted to do a leading of 130%, what I could do is 24 times 1.3, and that would change the leading. And this, to me, makes it even more readable, but we don't include as much text as we could have with 124% leading. So this helps you see why tracking and leading are important for readability of a block of text, because this is the same point size, but this one is so much more legible than this one over here. All right. Last but not least, we're going to talk about the difference between a typeface and a font. So I kind of lied to you earlier up here when I said these are examples of serif fonts, because these actually, they're technically fonts, but they're not actually fonts, if that makes sense. So let me show you kind of what I mean. So all the way down here, we have one typeface, but 3 fonts. So all of these words here are set in sen. So sen is, you could say, is the font, except this is actually 3 different fonts. So sen is actually a typeface, and a font is a variation of a typeface. So let me explain it this way. The typeface is the overall design of a family of characters. So all of these characters belong to the same typeface. A font is specific variations of a typeface. So these are 3 different fonts because this word is extra bold, this word is regular, and this word is semi-bold. So since this one is extra bold, this one is regular, and this one is semi-bold, that's actually 3 different fonts being used in one typeface. So I hope that makes sense of the difference. The typeface is the overall design of the characters, because they're all designed the same, but the font is a specific variation to achieve a certain effect. So the bold is a different font from a regular, which is a different font from an italics. So many times we say font when what we actually mean is typeface, because sen is a typeface. So all of these examples up here, these are all typefaces, these are all typefaces, these are all typefaces, and you can download them for free on Google Fonts. I'll leave that linked in the description. Now that you know the basics of typography, you need to know how to use each of these typefaces and how to choose the right typeface. And to watch me do it, you can click on this video here.